Enjoy being broke, Derek said, leaning back in the fraud investigation chair like this was funny. You're not getting that money back. I just stared at him across the tiny office table, trying to process how my best friend of 9 years could say that while my bank account sat nearly empty on the screen between us. 2 weeks earlier, I'd lost my job. Now every dollar I had left, rent money, savings, everything, was gone through transfers I never approved. The fraud officer asked Derek one simple question. You still claim you had nothing to do with these transactions? Derek smirked. Check whatever you want. The officer nodded slowly and opened another file. At first, he said nothing. Then his expression changed completely. He turned the monitor toward Derek and quietly said, Sir, you might want to sit down. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. For the first time that entire morning, Derek stopped smiling. The room went dead silent, except for the faint buzzing of the fluorescent light above us. I remember gripping the edge of my chair so hard my fingers hurt. Derek had spent the last hour acting untouchable, answering questions for me, interrupting me, even laughing when I explained that my rent check had bounced 3 days earlier because my savings account had been emptied overnight. But now he looked nervous. What is that supposed to mean? Derek asked, sitting forward. The fraud officer didn't answer immediately. He kept scrolling through the records on his screen, eyes narrowing like he'd found something he wasn't expecting. And sitting there watching him, I suddenly realized how insane this entire situation actually was. 3 weeks earlier, I was walking out of my office carrying a cardboard box after getting laid off from my marketing job. One random Tuesday afternoon, and my entire life flipped upside down. No warning. No severance worth talking about. Just a cold meeting with HR and security watching me clean out my desk while people I'd worked with for years avoided eye contact. Derek was the first person I called. He told me not to panic, said he'd help me get through it. Over the next couple weeks, he checked on me constantly. He brought groceries over when I stopped leaving my apartment. He kept telling me, "You'll bounce back, you always do." That's why none of this made sense. Because when my debit card got declined at a grocery store 4 days earlier, Derek was the one who drove me to the bank. I still remember standing at the ATM outside, refreshing my balance over and over because I thought there had to be a mistake. But there was. My checking account was nearly empty. My savings account was worse. Transfer after transfer after transfer, thousands of dollars disappearing across several days, while I slept in the next room completely unaware. And somehow, Derek never seemed surprised. The fraud officer finally leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. Then he looked directly at me and asked, Ms. Carter, why were all these transfers approved from a device connected inside your apartment? Inside my apartment, I repeated. My voice came out weaker than I wanted. I could already feel Derek looking at me from across the table, waiting to see how I'd react. The fraud officer rotated the monitor slightly so I could see the report. Rows of timestamps filled the screen beside IP addresses and login confirmations I didn't recognize. These transactions were authenticated through a trusted device, he explained. Same network, same location. That's impossible, I said immediately. I never approved any of this. Derek finally spoke up again, calm and almost amused. See, that's what I was trying to tell you earlier. Banks don't usually refund money when it comes from your own devices. Something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten. Not because he sounded concerned. Because he sounded prepared. As the officer continued asking questions, memories started replaying in my head differently. Derek had been at my apartment constantly after I lost my job. Sometimes he stayed over so late he'd just sleep on the couch. He knew my Wi-Fi password. He'd borrowed my laptop more than once to help me update my resume. A week earlier, he'd even insisted on fixing it after I complained it was running slow. At the time, none of that felt strange. Now every detail suddenly did. The officer asked if anyone else had access to my devices. I hesitated, And Derek answered before I could. "She's stressed," he said casually. "She probably forgot approving something." I turned toward him so fast my chair scraped the floor. "What does that mean?" "Marilyn, come on," he sighed. "You've barely slept since the layoff." The officer watched both of us carefully, but said nothing. That night, back at my apartment, I started digging through my email account looking for anything connected to the transfers. Most of the fraud alerts were gone. Deleted. My chest tightened as I opened the trash folder. Every single deleted security, email matched, dates Derek had stayed over. Then my phone rang. The caller ID showed the bank investigator. I answered immediately. And the first thing he said was, "Ms. Carter, your friend Derek just called asking whether you filed a police report." I stopped breathing for a second. I hadn't told Derek about the police report. In fact, I'd barely agreed to it myself. The investigator had suggested it that afternoon after noticing how quickly the money had been moved through multiple accounts. I was still sitting on my bedroom floor, surrounded by printed bank statements, when I asked the only thing that mattered. How would he even know that? There was a short pause on the line. "That's what we're trying to figure out," the investigator said carefully. "Did you discuss this case with anyone besides him?" "No." "Has he had access to your phone, email, banking apps?" The question made my skin crawl, because the answer was yes. After we hung up, I immediately changed every password I could think of. Banking, email, social media, even my streaming accounts. My hands were shaking so badly I kept mistyping everything. Then Derek started texting me. First casually, "You okay?" Then more aggressively when I stopped responding. "You're seriously filing reports over this?" By midnight, the messages got worse. "You're making yourself look guilty. Nobody's going to believe you if the transfers came from your apartment." That line hit hard because it was true. Every piece of evidence so far pointed directly at me. I was unemployed, desperate for money, and suddenly claiming fraud after draining my own accounts. Even I could see how bad it looked. And somehow Derek knew exactly where the investigation stood before I told him anything. The next morning, things got even worse. One of our mutual friends texted asking if I was doing okay mentally. Another asked whether I really believed the bank had stolen my money. Derek had already started talking. By the afternoon, I learned he'd been telling people I was spiraling after losing my job, that I was paranoid, that I'd become obsessed with blaming someone because I couldn't accept what happened to my finances. I felt completely trapped. Then the investigator called again. "We need both of you to come in tomorrow," he said. "There's a new development involving where the funds were transferred." "What kind of development?" "They were routed through cryptocurrency exchanges before disappearing." I went cold. This wasn't someone impulsively stealing a debit card. Whoever did this planned it. The next morning, Derek met me outside the fraud office like nothing was wrong. Calm, relaxed, even smiling. As we walked inside, he leaned close enough for only me to hear him. "You should have let this go." Before I could answer, the investigator opened the conference room door holding a thick printed file. Then he looked at both of us and said, "Before we begin, there's something neither of you knows yet." The investigator closed the conference room door behind us and laid the file on the table. This time, Derek didn't sit back confidently. He stayed stiff in his chair, watching every movement the investigator made. I could feel the tension building in the room. The investigator opened the folder slowly. We finished reviewing the device authentication logs tied to the transfers. Derek crossed his arms, and Ms. Carter was telling the truth about one thing, the investigator replied. The transactions did originate from her apartment network. Derek immediately looked at me like he'd won. But then the investigator continued. However, the device fingerprints don't fully match her laptop. Derek's expression shifted slightly. The investigator turned one of the reports toward us. Most of it looked like technical nonsense to me, but one phrase stood out. Cloned browser credentials detected. My stomach dropped. Suddenly, I remembered Derek sitting at my kitchen counter 2 weeks earlier while repairing my laptop. He told me my browser was overloaded with junk files. I remembered leaving the room to take a phone call while he stayed alone with it for nearly an hour. The investigator kept talking. Someone duplicated saved authentication data from Ms. Carter's browser and used it remotely. Derek gave a short laugh. That doesn't prove it was me. No, the investigator agreed calmly. Not by itself. He slid another photo onto the table. A still image from an ATM camera. The face was blurry, but the person wore a dark leather jacket with a white tear near the sleeve. I'd seen Derek wear that jacket constantly. That could be anybody, Derek snapped quickly. But now his voice sounded tighter. The investigator ignored him and opened another document. We also recovered deleted connection logs from Ms. Carter's home router. An unknown device accessed the network repeatedly between 2:00 and 4:00 a.m. over several nights. I looked directly at Derek. Those were the nights he stayed over. For the first time since this nightmare started, he looked nervous enough to stop talking. Then, suddenly, he straightened again like he remembered something. None of that proves anything, he said firmly. The investigator nodded once. Actually, he replied, opening the final file, it proves more than you think. He rotated the monitor toward Derek. And all the color drained from Derek's face. For a second, nobody spoke. Derek just stared at the screen like he'd stopped understanding what he was looking at. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. The investigator finally broke the silence. You made one mistake, he said. He pointed to a transaction history displayed on the monitor. Most of the stolen money had been routed through multiple cryptocurrency exchanges, bouncing between temporary wallets designed to hide where it ended up. But one transfer was highlighted in red. A small amount, barely noticeable compared to the rest. At the beginning, the investigator explained, you tested the system using an older wallet before moving the larger transfers. Derek swallowed hard. Unfortunately for him, that wallet had already been linked to his identity months earlier during a tax verification process on another exchange. Same name. Same ID. Same recovery email. The investigator clicked another screen, showing login records. And after installing remote access software on Ms. Carter's laptop, you used cloned browser credentials to approve the transactions remotely while connected to her apartment network. I felt sick hearing it said out loud. Every strange moment suddenly connected perfectly. Derek insisting on fixing my laptop. The deleted bank alerts. The late-night internet activity. Him always asking whether my unemployment money had arrived. He'd planned everything while pretending to help me survive losing my job. Derek finally snapped. This is insane, he barked. She owed me. I stared at him. The investigator stayed calm. Excuse me. For years, Derek shot back, pointing at me now. I was always there for her, helping her, listening to her problems, giving her money when she needed it. You stole my savings, I said quietly. You had money sitting there while I was drowning, he shouted. And that was the moment something inside me completely broke. Not because of the money. Because none of this had happened by accident. While I was grieving my job, panicking about rent, crying in front of someone I trusted like family, he'd already decided to rob me. The investigator signaled toward the uniformed officer near the door. Everything after that happened fast. Derek stood up immediately when the officer approached him. You can't arrest me over assumptions. But the investigator calmly listed the charges anyway. Financial fraud. Identity theft. Unauthorized computer access. The handcuffs clicked around Derek's wrists while he kept trying to argue. I didn't say another word to him. A week later, the bank officially confirmed the fraud findings and reversed most of the stolen transfers. Not all immediately, but enough to stop the eviction process on my apartment. By then, the story had spread through our friend group. People who ignored my calls suddenly wanted to apologize. A few admitted Derek had convinced them I was unstable after losing my job. Others claimed they didn't know who to believe. I stopped caring. Derek lost his job shortly after the investigation became public. Last I heard, he'd taken a plea deal to avoid a longer sentence. But even after the money came back, the damage didn't disappear overnight. My credit had taken a hit. My sense of trust was worse. I moved to a different apartment 2 months later, closed every old account I had, replaced every device, and started rebuilding my life slowly with a smaller remote marketing job. Then one evening, I got a voicemail notification from an unknown jail number. I stared at it for a long time, then deleted it without listening, because the money eventually came back. But the version of me that trusted Derek never did.